Hello and welcome to this ArcSight logger tutorial and demonstration. Today's demonstration we're going to be talking about storage groups.
Firstly, let's explain the components behind a logger storage group to help us understand how we build out logical separation of these events. So firstly, we have the notion of a reporting device, or otherwise known as a device in logger. So this isn't necessarily an endpoint device such as an Active Directory or a firewall, but in actual fact, it's more than likely a smart connector with multiple endpoints reporting into it. And that's our first piece. These devices then get rolled up into what's called a device group. And typically in Logger, you would separate your device groups into business requirements or the need to perhaps separate those events from one another, such as SOCs, PCI, etc. So in this case, I've got multiple smart connectors receiving events for PCI, and that makes a lot of sense. That helps me build out physical as well as logical separation of those important events for compliance. I then have the notion of a storage rule. The easiest way to think of a storage rule is the glue that binds the device group to the storage group. So in other words, a storage rule simply says if it's a PCI event or if it's an event from this particular device group, I want that event to be sent to my PCI storage group. So it's a very, very straightforward concept. Once that storage rule has been hit, we then simply have Logger send those events automatically to the corresponding storage group. So in our case, we have logically separated PCI events, and we don't have to then worry about separation of those events. Logger is taking care of that for us. So just to reiterate, devices or reporting devices are typically a smart connector with multiple endpoints reporting into them or sending events. These devices get rolled up into what's called a device group. So in other words, multiple smart connectors receiving events for such as PCI, and we'll keep using PCI as our example throughout this video. We then write a very simple storage rule that says if I see events from this device group, I want it sent to this particular storage group, in our case, PCI.
So let's take a look at what I'm talking about when we talk about reporting devices. So firstly, taking a look at our summary page on Logger, event summary by device. 10.0.0.12. Let's take a closer look at this reporting device. If we click on it, it will automatically take us to our search pane and it will fill out the search for us device group in 10.0.0.1.2. So effectively we're looking for events that are inside of this device group. So we're sort of working backwards here, but it helps explain the concept of this reporting device. So my searches come back here with a number of events, 350,000 events, and you'll notice here that we've got 53 different vendors. So we've got open source for Unix, we've got NetScreen, Apache, ArcSight, HP, and so forth. So what that's telling us is that there's lots of different event types and lots of different event sources hitting this particular reporting device, which is 10.0.0.12. So this is obviously a smart connector that's taking in events from a number of different sources, as you can see. So let's take a look at the receivers themselves, and this will help further cement this particular concept. So here we have our PCI events receiver. So what we've done here is said, I want all of my PCI related events to hit this one particular receiver, and those PCI events will come from those PCI related devices which make up my PCI device group. So this is just like any other receiver, but we've chosen to designate it as pertinent to PCI events themselves. So if we take a look at devices, click on devices, you'll see here all of my different reporting devices. Everything from demo to raw to SOCs and so forth. But what's interesting here is, and what you might first think of is, well, hang on, you've got more than one reporting device, IP address reporting to a particular receiver, and that's absolutely correct. You'll see here for PCI, we've got .17 and .18 reporting into this receiver called PCI events. And our previous example, .12, is actually sending events into demo_events. And of course, there's more than one receiving device actually sending events into demo_events as well. So this, in the case of PCI, we'll keep using this PCI example. .17 and .18 are those devices that are actually sending events. So let's take it up to the next level and say, well, here are reporting devices. So this is why it's important to keep in mind that when we talk about reporting devices, you are not going to see every single endpoint device that is sending events. So you're not going to see all of your individual firewalls, active directories, and so forth. This is effectively, in a well-architected solution, a grouping of all of your different smart connectors sending events into Logger. We then take those devices, and as we said before in the PowerPoint presentation, we take those devices and build them up into a device group. And so this device group, in our example, we've called it PCI. And the devices that are actually reporting into this group are, of course, as we'd expect to see, .17 and .18. PCI_events is, of course, the receiver that we've chosen those smart connectors to send the events to. Now, if I wish to add more devices to my PCI device group, it's very easy to achieve this. I'll go to device groups again. I'll click on PCI, and then you'll notice here that I press down Control and I click to add more devices to that particular device group, to my PCI device group. And those reporting devices .13, .14, .19 and .20 will now be sending their events to that particular device group. And the device group, as we've defined, becomes very important when we talk about steps 3 and 4, the storage rules and the storage group itself. So let's move on to that. I'll cancel this. I don't want to add those devices to the PCI group. But now, let's take a look at storage rules. Storage rules is saying, I want to store, based on priority, where my events are going to store events for particular device groups. So you'll notice here my storage group is PCI Storage Group, and we'll talk about the storage group itself very shortly. But the device group itself is what we saw before, PCI. So the .17 and the .18 devices, reporting devices that are grouped logically into this device group called PCI. And those events from those reporting devices will logically be sent to this PCI storage group. So that's where we start to make the linkage between the reporting device, the device group, and that storage rule becomes the glue, so to speak, from the device group through to the storage group. And lastly, you may have noticed this column called priority. Priority allows us to prioritize where events will be sent to, and if they don't fit any storage rule, they will end up in the default storage group, which is not actually listed here because it doesn't need to be. Think of it as the catch-all storage group for any event. So effectively, think of it as events coming into Logger, hitting the storage rules, and the first rule it's going to hit is, of course, the PCI storage group rule. Now, if the reporting device is not part of the PCI device group, it will simply try and match it to the next rule, which is SOX. If it doesn't hit that, it moves to the next, and then the next, and then lastly, it will end up in the default storage group. So effectively, it allows us to pick out and logically separate the most important events based on our business requirement, and then leave the rest to fall into that default storage group. All right, so let's move on to the actual storage group itself. All we need to do here is type in STOR. That will bring us up our storage groups here in the context-sensitive help menu. Takes us to storage groups, and you'll notice here storage groups has a number of different options pertaining to each one. You'll see here, obviously, a name gives us a logical separation here. Maximum archive days or age, And what that means is how long we will store an actual archive for that particular storage group. Now I've got here -1 or -1 for all of my archives. In other words, I never want you to delete archives. The great part about Logger is that you can actually specify separate archive paths. They might be to cheaper NAS storage, cloud, wherever it may be. So we can save all of our Logger archives with 100% integrity for as long as we wish. We can go well beyond 7 years. We can keep them forever if we want to. So -1 says don't ever delete my archives. I could have a maximum archive age of perhaps 720 days. So any archives after the 2-year period will effectively be deleted out of my archives. The second column is what we call a maximum live data age. So this is effectively the online events that are searchable and reportable on my given Logger. So you'll see here, this is one of the really great features of having logical separation through storage groups, is that I can have a different retention policy based on the storage group. So each of my customers here, so think of storage groups as not just being able to logically separate business requirements such as PCI, SOCs, and so forth, but I might also have different partners or customers or business units within my organization falling under these different storage groups themselves, and they may have different storage retentions. So this might be 6 months, 180 days. I've got something like PCI, which I'm dictated to keep for 720 days. Internal events, so those events that are internally generated by Logger and other systems and so forth, I'm going to keep those for a year. SOCs, I'm going to keep for as long as I possibly can online. Events that fall outside of this range or this timeline effectively are overwritten by new events. So it's one way of keeping just that number of days events within Logger and not overfilling the Logger itself. The third column, or the fourth column, is the allocated gigabytes. Now this is just a small virtual machine, so I've only got a very small amount of space allocated to each of these storage groups. But this is, again, a really great way of making very efficient usage of storage groups and the physical disk or the physical storage that is attached to your Logger installation. So you might have a very large amount of space dedicated to these compliance type situations like PCI and SOCs. You'll also have a very long retention time as well. So that would make sense that we can actually have a lot more space dedicated. Now, if you've got a logical separation or a storage group that has an extraordinarily low event rate, there's no point giving it terabytes of space if it's going to take up years and years to actually fill that space. You're better off giving that space to more important event sources that have a higher EPS rate or a longer retention period requirement. And so this gives us another avenue to actually logically separate and make better use of the space that we have. Again, once we fill that allocated space, those events will start to be deleted out of the online event storage allocation. But of course, we still are archiving all of our events as well, so we're not losing anything. Everything is kept. Next column is obviously how much we've actually used of that space. Keep in mind again that Logger does a very good job of compressing events on disk, and so that makes it far greater efficiency in terms of actually being able to restore those events. You may have noticed also that I've only got a 30-day retention for what we call our default storage group. And that makes a lot of sense in my situation. I've obviously got a much longer retention time for my very, very important events such as PCI and SOCs. But anything that doesn't fall into those two compliance requirements that we define through our storage rules, as we saw before, or they go to the catch-all default storage group, and those events will be only kept online for 30 days because we know that there is far less priority on those events. So this is a great way, again, of using much more efficient use of the space and the processing power that we have available within our Logger installation. So let's just take a slightly closer look at one of these storage groups. So PCI, for example, we can obviously make changes to what occurs here in terms of its configuration. I can change the maximum days I can change the maximum amount of allocated space in the archive days as well. So this makes it very flexible. I might find that over time I need to increase those numbers, and that's perfectly valid. I can also decrease those numbers, but bearing in mind that the events that fall outside of that new window will actually, of course, be deleted. So it's best to make sure that your archives are up to date. But that gives us a lot of flexibility to actually change our configuration over time to meet our requirements. Let's now take a look at how we can utilize storage groups within searches themselves for greater efficiency and ease of finding what we're actually looking for in our searches. So firstly, we'll take the classic search and we will run a search for the last 30 minutes. Now my EPS, my incoming EPS is not high, it's around 60 to 70, but you'll notice in the last 30 minutes I've had just short of 120,000 events come into my system. But what we can do is we can greatly reduce the amount of work that Logger has to perform to find events that I'm interested in. And we're going to use this operator called _storage group in, and then we give it in square brackets the actual name or names of the storage groups that we're interested in. So in other words, I can take this search and say to Logger, I want you to search for the last 30 minutes, all events, but only within this one storage group, PCI Storage Group. So if I click go now, keeping in mind that I did have 118,000 events flow in the last 30 minutes, I then perform that same search. You may or may not have noticed that that was quicker to actually respond and send the information back. I've only got 25,000 events. So in other words, I'm already greatly reducing the amount of work or the number of events that Logger has to process in order to find what I'm looking for. So you'll remember that obviously there's a lot of different devices reporting into this particular storage group because it is made up of our PCI device group, and obviously there are a number of reporting PCI devices. So just to give us a quick understanding of what we might be dealing with in terms of source addresses, you can see here I've done a quick chart against all my top source addresses for this particular storage group, and you'll see that there's a number of them here. And not all events are going to have an actual source address in it. That's fine, but this just helps exemplify the fact there are many endpoint devices actually sending events to the smart connectors to be part of the device group, and thus sending those events to the given storage group based on the storage rule that we've actually applied, and we saw that just previously. So let's take another example where we could say, well, what if it's across multiple storage groups? I want to look in SOCs and PCI. We can expand this section here and actually have multiple storage groups within my search. So if I change this slightly to include SOCs as well, you can see, hey, I want to do a search across the last 30 minutes within PCI and my SOC storage groups. So I press go again, and instead of 25,000 odd events, I'm now sitting around 34,000. So obviously SOCs has something like 14,000 events in it for the last 30 minutes. So if I remove my PCI storage group, roughly 8,500 events. So this gives us an example of how we can actually narrow down, focus in on what it is we're actually interested in based on a storage group. This becomes important also for reporting, and that's what we'll cover next. So let's now take a look at the reporting aspect of storage groups and how they can be used effectively. So we're here within the reporting section of Logger. I'm going to generate a PCI report. So we'll just do the PCI general executive level report. So it's just a high level report. You double click on it. That will begin generating the actual report itself. and it will then ask us some parameters around how we want to refine that report. So in my case, I'm just going to run this against the last 2 hours of events. I'm going to make it a local only report. And you'll notice down here that you actually have the option of including device groups and storage groups, as well as individual devices if you wish. And this becomes very powerful because I can actually then refine my report down to individual device groups or storage groups. So let's leave this all blank for now. But if I press run and I'm interested in PCI from a PCI only perspective, you can already imagine that this generates an interesting problem in that I've just generated a report that seemingly pertains only to PCI, but it is actually taking into account non-PCI events. So even though I've got an executive report here and I've got some nice dashboards and bar graphs and so forth, it's actually entirely inaccurate because it's not refined against only PCI events. You'll see here I've got 158 counts of particular vulnerabilities and so forth. And so this really doesn't have a lot of relevance. So what I'll do is I'll cancel that report and I'll run it again, but this time I'll take advantage of my storage groups. So as we know, I've made sure that all of my reporting devices that are pertinent to PCI fall into a PCI device group, and a storage rule that we've created then sends all of those PCI events to that logical separation, that storage group called PCI Storage Group. So what we've done here, we've told Logger to only use events from that particular PCI storage group. The other way I could achieve this is if I utilize just my PCI device group. I can do it. I can achieve the same thing that way, but that potentially leaves us open to what if we had more than one device group that is relevant to PCI storage. So let's go ahead and now run that report again. And the new report is running. And now we have a very different executive report. My top 10 vulnerabilities are very different, and other pieces as well in terms of user accessing databases and so forth. So this is a very quick example of where storage groups can be highly effective in the use of reporting as well as searching. And last but not least, we're going to cover off, in finishing this demonstration, a look at how we can use filters within storage groups to further refine what events users have access to. So let's cover that now. We can take advantage of storage groups to allow or disallow access to certain event types. So if we take PCI, for example, generally we don't want non-PCI folks getting access to PCI events. I use PCI quite deliberately because you might want to have some people have access only to PCI events, and you might explicitly want to deny access to everyone else. So this is a good example. So what we've got here is the concept of a search group filter. A search group filter is effectively a filter that can be applied at a user group or user level. And so it effectively becomes a transparent access control. So we go to search groups. You'll notice we've got two here in place already. So we've got one here by default. You'll notice that the filter is there is no filter. We've created another one called Snort Group, which basically allows access to only Snort IDS type events. So we're going to go and create our own one for PCI. It's important to note here, we don't actually create them here. This is just Logger's way of displaying the search group filters in a nice, neat place. Where we actually define them is, of course, in the filter section itself. So we'll click on filters and we add a new filter. And the important thing to remember here is we change it from type unified down to search group. And so that's the third type of search we can create. So I might call it PCI filter. Create that search group. And I then have the opportunity to either write a regex query or a unified query. I'll hit OK to this because I just want to update the query itself from regex to a unified query. And I'm effectively going to use what I had in my search phrase beforehand, where I used storage group in PCI Storage Group. And that's exactly what we did in our search before. Storage group in PCI Storage Group. So that, if it's appended to any search, will automatically refine the search, any other part of the search, to just pertaining to the PCI storage group. So I'm going to save that. That's my PCI filter for now. Now that we've created this PCI filter, you'll see it here in my filters list, just like any other unified query or regular expression, and there's the actual query there. So what we want to do now is actually have a group, a user group, actually have this filter apply to all of their searches. So the way that we do this is in the user and group management section. So under user management, we have our notion of users and of course groups. And the group type that we're interested in for this rights assignment is called the logger search groups piece. And what that means is groups of users can be assigned these actual logger search groups, and those logger search groups have search group filters applied to them. So what we first need to do is, of course, add a new group, because at the moment we've got format preserving encryption group, a SOX group, and a snort group, as we saw before, for applying IDS only events to somebody's search. So I'll go ahead and create a new group, and I'm going to call it PCI. That would probably be most appropriate. PCI auditors, for example, we might call that. Now the group type, as I said before, is an actual logger search. And we'll save and close that. But firstly, we do have the option here of allowing people to search for events, and we can even restrict on whether they can search remote or peer loggers. So I'll save that group, and there's my group there, PCI auditors. I'm then going to edit the membership and actually add a user to that PCI group. I'll add the user auditor, because right now they're unassigned any user group. So now auditor has that logger search PCI group attached to it. And last but not least, what we want to do now is go back to search group filters, and under our PCI group, you'll notice that we don't actually have a filter. So we created that group within the user management section, but now we want to actually apply a filter to it. We come here and we've got our, notice how the only filters that we have to apply to this search group filter is actually search group filters themselves. So that's why the list is so short. PCI filter, we created that just before, save that. And now that I've saved it, what I'll do is, to prove that we're actually instantiating this transparent filter, what I'll do is, as user admin, I'll just run a very quick search on the last 10 minutes. Hit go. And you'll see that we've received around 37, 38, 39,000 events in the last 10 minutes. So now what I'll do is I'll log out and log back in as the auditor user who has that PCI filter applied to it by default, even though it's exactly the same search. My GUI will be slightly different because I'm an end user. I've restricted access to certain features, but that's okay. So last 10 minutes, all fields, hit go again. And I'm now down below 8,000 events. So we've restricted my search as an auditor, a PCI auditor, to PCI only events. And we can see here the device, the events are only coming from .17 and .18, otherwise known as PCI underscore events, which is of course the logger receiver that is receiving my PCI events. So we're only seeing, no matter what I put in here as my search criteria, it can be anything whatsoever, it's always going to come back with only events that come from the PCI storage group. So that's all been done transparently for me. And just to show you a little bit more detail of how the actual search is transparently created for us, if we go and put something else in place in my search query here, let's say we want to put an AND there. Now we're immediately going to have an error returned. You'll see here parsing storage group in, and it's got two ANDs there in the search query. So this part here is the transparent piece that we put in our filter, and then Logger has automatically put in an AND for us. So whenever an end user comes along to actually put a search phrase in here, we don't need to worry about starting as an AND. So it's another example of how it's been done very transparently. But what's interesting, if I want to say negate that transparent filter, so we know the filter is going to be automatically storage group in PCI storage group, and if I come along and put an AND not in PCI storage group, we can imagine what's going to happen here. I'm going to have no events returned, and that makes a lot of sense because firstly I'm searching PCI events only, and then I'm excluding PCI events, so it makes sense that there's no results returned. And there's our results set again for the last 10 minutes. So a scenario that's completely the opposite but just as relevant is, what if I want to have users that have absolutely no access to PCI events? We effectively want to have a Logger search group that negates the use of or the inclusion of PCI events, and that's very easy to achieve as well. So let's go to our search filter groups again. And we know our PCI group's there. So we're going to create a non-PCI group. So firstly, as we did before, we need to create the filter first. So we're effectively negating this filter. And we'll call it non-PCI filter. It's a search group. And the query is going to be a unified query. So I'll change that from a regex. So to negate or exclude PCI, we're going to put a not in PCI storage group, effectively giving us the opposite. Save that. And so now if we go back to our user management, this same auditor, we might make them instead a non-PCI auditor. Let's say they're a SOX only auditor. This PCI group, we've still got that there. And what we're going to do here is create a new Logger search group, non-PCI group, users who are non-PCI. It is a search Logger search type. We don't have any users that we can use, so let's create a new user. All right, so I've just filled out a brand new user. We're going to call him non-PCI user. And I've just got to give them now a Logger search group, non-PCI group. And that should be all that we need to actually make this person real. And there they are there. Take a look at the membership. There's that non-PCI user. So now the last thing we need to do is, as we did before, was assign the actual non-PCI filter to the filter group. So right now, non-PCI group has no filter. So let's go and update that. And non-PCI filter, save. and that filter for non-PCI group is now ready to go. So what I'll do is I'll log out and I'll log in as that non-PCI user and try a search. Again, I've got a restricted view because I'm a user. Last 10 minutes, hit go. Roughly 25,000 events. And so these are non-PCI events. You'll see here flow data and so forth. So from anything but the actual PCI events themselves. And so that's been very transparent in eliminating those PCI events. And just to bring up an error message quite deliberately here so we can actually see what the real query is, you'll see there was a problem parsing my actual search here. Search group not in PCI group. So in other words, Logger has transparently appended this whole piece from here through and including the AND in this actual search. Hence, I will never see, as this user, PCI related events. So I just wanted to point out one last great benefit of using these transparent filters within search, in that you may have noticed before when we were talking about storage groups in general, storage groups can be used to logically separate not only different event types within an organization, but if you are actually ingesting events from multiple partners, customers, maybe even business units and so forth, and you wanted to restrict people's or partners' access to those various storage groups, you can do that with the same filter mechanism that we've actually employed today. So you could have a filter for anyone who is part of customer A that only allows to include customer A information. And the same thing goes for customer B, C, and D, and however many customers that you have. So this concludes our tutorial on ArcSight Logger storage groups. We hope you've gained the knowledge around reporting devices, device groups, the storage rules, which effectively glue the events from device groups through to storage groups. And you can see the benefits of using storage groups within your Logger implementation. Thank you.